Have you ever sat in a room full of people you've known for years and felt strangely alone? Not rejected, not attacked, just disconnected. They're laughing at the same jokes, talking about the same things, reacting the same way they always have. But something inside you isn't responding the way it used to. You smile, you nod, you participate, and yet there's a quiet space between you and them that didn't exist before. That space feels uncomfortable because no one did anything wrong. There was no fight, no betrayal, no dramatic ending, just distance. And the most confusing part? You don't feel superior. You don't feel enlightened. You feel lonely. This is one of the least discussed parts of psychological growth. We talk about healing as empowerment. We talk about self-awareness as clarity. We talk about boundaries as strength. But we rarely talk about what happens after. When you begin integrating parts of yourself, your internal structure changes. And when your internal structure changes, your relational dynamics change. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, integrating unconscious aspects of yourself into conscious awareness. But individuation does not happen in isolation from relationships. When you change internally, the way you relate shifts, and sometimes that shift creates distance. Let's make this real. Maybe you use a bond with friends through complaining, long conversations about how unfair things were, about people who hurt you, about how exhausting life felt. There was intensity in those conversations, a shared emotional rhythm. But over time, you began processing your emotions differently. You stopped feeding resentment. You stopped replaying old stories. You started taking responsibility where you once blamed. Now, when the same conversations begin, you feel slightly out of sync, not judgmental, just tired. And that tiredness feels confusing because these are people you care about. These are people who supported you. So you wonder, why don't I feel the same closeness? Growth does not always feel like expansion. Sometimes it feels like separation. Jung understood that as we individuate, we differentiate from the collective in simpler terms. As you become more aware of who you are, you become less dependent on who you were expected to be. And many relationships are built on shared roles. The funny one, the emotional one, the strong one, the agreeable one. When you shift out of role, the dynamic destabilizes. Let's say you were always the people pleaser in your group. You smoothed tension. You agreed easily. You avoided conflict. Now you are more honest. You say no sometimes. You express discomfort. You don't laugh at things that don't feel right. The group may not reject you, but something changes. The ease shifts. You might feel subtle tension, or you might feel internal discomfort because you are no longer performing your old role. That discomfort can be misinterpreted as loneliness, but often it is recalibration. The version of you that fit perfectly into that dynamic is dissolving, and until a new equilibrium forms, there is space. Space feels empty, and emptiness is uncomfortable. There's another layer to this. Sometimes what bonded you to someone was not joy. It was shared pain, shared trauma, shared insecurity, shared survival strategies. When you heal parts of that pain, the bond weakens, not because the person is bad, but because the emotional glue has changed. If you bonded over anxiety and you become calmer, the emotional intensity decreases. If you bonded over chaos and you choose stability, the rhythm changes. And stability can feel boring in comparison to chaos, which creates confusion. You might think, was it ever real? It was real, but it was real for who you were at the time. Jung believed that we project unconscious parts of ourselves onto others. In relationships, we often connect through those projections. When we begin integrating those projected parts, the emotional charge reduces, and reduced emotional charge can feel like distance. Imagine you had a friend who always reassured you. They told you that you were good enough. They validated you constantly. It felt comforting. But as you develop self-trust, you rely less on external reassurance. You still care about them, but you no longer feel the same urgency to reach out. That shift can feel like fading closeness, but it may simply be decreasing dependency. Dependency often masquerades as intimacy. When dependency reduces, the relationship either evolves or weakens. And evolution requires mutual growth. But not everyone grows at the same pace. That is where loneliness enters, because growth is personal. You cannot force others to change with you, and you cannot unsee what you now see. You may sit in familiar environments and notice. The gossip feels heavier. The negativity feels louder. The emotional volatility feels unnecessary. You do not feel better than anyone. You just feel different. Difference can be isolating, especially when your external world has not yet aligned with your internal shift. There is also grief in this stage. Grief for the ease you once had. Grief for the automatic belonging. Grief for the version of yourself that fits seamlessly. It is easier to grow in theory than in relationship, because relationship mirrors identity. And when identity shifts, mirrors change. You might even question yourself. Am I becoming distant? Am I isolating? Am I judging people unfairly? Those are healthy questions. Growth is not superiority. But here is something important. Maturity often reduces reactivity. When you're less reactive, you may engage less dramatically. And if your relationships were fueled by high emotional reactivity, the reduction can feel like loss. But calm connection is quieter. It takes time to recognize it. In this early phase, what you feel most strongly is the space, the in-between. You are not who you were, but you are not yet surrounded by people who match who you are becoming. That gap feels lonely, and loneliness is not proof that you're doing something wrong. It is often the emotional cost of differentiation. Differentiation means you are no longer merging unconsciously. You are aware where you end and others begin, and awareness creates space. Space can feel cold before it feels peaceful. If you are in this stage, the most important thing is not to panic. Do not rush to reconnect with dynamics that feel misaligned just to avoid discomfort. Do not force yourself to regress into roles that feel tight. Instead, observe gently which connections still feel nourishing, even if quieter, which ones feel draining, even if familiar, which spaces feel empty and which feel peaceful. Loneliness and peace can feel similar at first. Both are quieter than chaos. Both are less intense than dependency. But peace feels grounded. Loneliness feels unsettled. This first stage of outgrowing is rarely glamorous. It is not dramatic. It is subtle. A slight hesitation before speaking. A slight pause before laughing. A slight fatigue after interactions that once energized you. Pay attention to those signals. They are not accusations. They are information. You are not obligated to sever ties immediately. You are not required to reinvent your social world overnight. But you are invited to notice. Notice where you feel aligned. Notice where you feel performed. Notice where you feel small. Growth is not always about adding new people. Sometimes it is about allowing certain dynamics to loosen naturally. That loosening feels like distance. And distance feels like loneliness. But loneliness is sometimes a space required for a more honest connection to emerge. You are not broken for feeling disconnected. You are differentiating. And differentiation always feels unfamiliar at first. The question is not, how do I go back to how it was? The question is, who am I becoming, and what kind of connection fits that version of me? The answer will not come immediately, but the awareness itself is the beginning. The hardest part is not the distance. It's the guilt. You start noticing the shift. You feel less engaged, less emotionally fused, less reactive. And instead of feeling mature, you feel like you're abandoning people. You think, they were there for me. We've been through so much together. Maybe I'm the one changing too much. That guilt can pull you back into old dynamics. You might laugh at jokes that don't sit right anymore. You might tolerate conversations that feel draining. You might shrink slightly just to preserve familiarity, because familiarity feels safer than loneliness. But here is something deeply important. Outgrowing is not the same as rejecting, and distance is not the same as disrespect. Carl Jung understood that individuation involves differentiation from the collective psyche. In simple terms, as you become more conscious of yourself, you naturally detach from unconscious group patterns. That detachment feels like separation, and separation feels like loss. There is grief in realizing that certain bonds were sustained by versions of you that no longer exist. Maybe you were bonded through shared insecurity. You both doubted yourselves. You both feared abandonment. You both sought constant reassurance. That bond felt intense. But now you're less anxious, more grounded, more self-trusting, and the dynamic doesn't activate the same way. There's less urgency, less drama, less emotional fusion. And instead of relief, you feel sadness because the intensity is gone. Many people mistake intensity for intimacy, but intensity is often just shared dysregulation. When two nervous systems are activated together, it feels electric. When one becomes regulated, the electricity fades. That fading can feel like emotional loss. Let's bring this into daily reality. Imagine you used to talk to a friend every single day. You shared everything. You processed every minor inconvenience together. Now you handle small frustrations on your own. You don't feel the need to text immediately. You're not avoiding them. You're just stable. And because you're stable, the rhythm changes. The silence between conversations becomes longer, and that silence can feel like something is wrong. But maybe nothing is wrong. Maybe dependency has reduced. Dependency often disguises itself as closeness. And when dependency decreases, space increases. Space feels uncomfortable when you're not used to it. You might also notice something else. You don't resonate with certain topics anymore. The gossip feels heavier. The complaining feels repetitive. The emotional chaos feels exhausting. But you don't want to judge anyone, so you stay quiet. And that quietness creates internal tension. You're physically present, but psychologically withdrawing. That withdrawal feels isolating. And here is where many people sabotage their growth. They try to reignite old energy. They exaggerate reactions. They overengage in drama. They perform their former personality. Why? Because it restores familiarity. But afterward, you feel drained because you betrayed your current state. This is where grief must be acknowledged, not dramatic grief. Quiet grief, grief that says, this connection mattered deeply in its time, but it may not fit the same way now. Jung believed that psychological development requires letting go of earlier identifications, earlier identities, earlier roles, earlier emotional patterns. But letting go is rarely clean. You may not lose the person. You may lose the dynamic. And that is confusing because the person is still there. You still care. But the emotional chemistry has shifted. There's another layer. Sometimes the loneliness is not about them. It is about the loss of who you were with them. Maybe you were more carefree, more spontaneous, more emotionally expressive. Now you feel more contained, more selective, more reflective, and part of you misses the older version of yourself, even if that version was less stable. Growth involves complexity. You don't just gain maturity. You lose simplicity. Earlier relationships often required less differentiation. You blended. You merged. You mirrored. Now you're more defined. Defined edges create boundaries. Boundaries create space. Space creates the sensation of distance. But distance is not always disconnection. It is separation of identities. Healthy relationships allow differentiation. Unconscious ones resist it. If someone is uncomfortable with your growth, they may subtly try to pull you back. You've changed. You're not as fun anymore. You're too serious now. Those comments can sting, because part of you fears isolation. Humans are wired for belonging. Belonging once required sameness. But mature belonging requires authenticity. Authenticity may reduce the number of people who resonate, but it increases the quality of resonance. That shift takes time. In the middle of that shift, you may feel socially displaced, not fully aligned with old dynamics, not yet aligned with new ones. That middle stage is the loneliest. It feels like standing between worlds. And the temptation during the stage is regression, going back to what felt easy. But easy is not always aligned. If you constantly leave interactions feeling heavy, that is information. If you leave feeling calm but less intense, that is different information. Learn to distinguish between boredom and misalignment. Sometimes what you call boredom is simply the absence of chaos. And if you are accustomed to chaos, calm can feel empty. Ask yourself, am I lonely because I lack stimulation? Or am I lonely because I lack resonance? Those are not the same. Stimulation can be created anywhere. Resonance requires shared depth. As you mature psychologically, your threshold for superficiality lowers. You crave fewer conversations, but more meaningful ones. Fewer people, but deeper connection. That refinement feels isolating at first, because refinement reduces volume. Volume is replaced by depth, and depth takes time to find. You may need to tolerate seasons of fewer interactions while your relational world reorganizes. This does not mean cutting everyone off. It means allowing dynamics to evolve naturally. Some will adapt with you, some will not. Neither outcome defines your worth. The loneliness you feel is not punishment. It is recalibration. Your nervous system is adjusting to a new relational pattern. Your identity is stabilizing around authenticity rather than belonging at any cost. That stabilization requires patience. And patience often feels like solitude. But solitude is not abandonment. It is space for alignment. If you rush to fill that space with noise, you may delay the formation of more compatible bonds. Stay steady. Observe without blaming. Grieve without dramatizing. You are not losing everyone. You are refining, and refinement always reduces before it expands. There is a quiet strength in not dramatizing the shift. When you begin outgrowing certain dynamics, the temptation is to make a clean cut, to define it, to label it, to announce that you've moved on. But most relational evolution is not dramatic. It is gradual. You talk a little less. You share a little less. You engage differently. And instead of forcing an ending, you allow the dynamic to reveal its natural direction. This is maturity. Carl Jung believed that individuation does not require isolation from humanity. It requires authenticity within it. You are not meant to sever every connection that no longer feels identical to your past. You are meant to relate differently. That distinction matters. Sometimes outgrowing someone does not mean removing them from your life. It means adjusting the level of intimacy. Not everyone is meant to have access to your deepest reflections. Not everyone is meant to walk beside you at every stage. Some relationships become lighter. Some become seasonal. Some become occasional. And that is not failure. That is differentiation. If you're feeling lonely during this stage, ask yourself something gently. Am I trying to preserve closeness that no longer fits? Or am I allowing closeness to reshape? Preserving what has expired creates tension. Allowing reshaping creates space. For example, imagine you had a friend you once spoke to daily. You processed everything together. Now you speak once a week. And instead of emotional intensity, you share updates calmly. That may feel like loss at first, but it may simply be a healthier rhythm. The absence of intensity does not mean the absence of care. It may mean the absence of dependency. There is also something important to remember. You do not need everyone to understand your growth. You do not need to justify your quieter presence. You do not need to explain why you no longer resonate with certain conversations. Silence can be graceful. A simple shift in participation often communicates more than a speech ever could. And the people who are aligned with your current self will feel that shift without resentment. The ones who are not may feel distance. But distance is not hostility. It is misalignment. Misalignment does not require anger. It requires honesty, internally, first. Here is something practical you can do. Instead of asking, should I cut this person off? Ask, how do I feel after spending time with them? Do you feel drained and tight in your body? Or do you feel neutral and calm? Drainage is information. Calm neutrality may simply be reduced intensity. Learn to trust the signals in your nervous system. Growth often stabilizes your nervous system. And when you are stable, chaos feels louder. But louder does not mean deeper. It simply means more activated. As you stabilize, you may begin attracting different types of connection. Slower conversations, more reflective exchanges, fewer but more meaningful interactions. But these do not appear instantly. There's often a transitional season where your old relational world is loosening and your new one has not fully formed. That in-between season feels quiet. Do not rush to fill it with noise. Solitude during transition is not social failure. It is recalibration. Jung wrote about the importance of holding tension between opposites. Right now, you may be holding two truths. You care about these people, and you are no longer who you were with them. Both can be true. You can appreciate the role someone played in your life without forcing them into your future in the same way. Gratitude does not require permanent proximity. Another important shift in this stage is internal. You begin relating to yourself differently. Earlier, belonging may have been your highest priority. Now, alignment feels more important. Belonging says, fit in. Alignment says, be honest. Alignment may reduce quantity, but it increases integrity. And integrity feels steadier than approval. If loneliness arises, do not immediately label it as evidence that you made a mistake. Ask, is this loneliness asking me to regress or to refine? Regression will tempt you to shrink. Refinement will invite you to stay steady. There is courage in allowing relationships to change without hostility. There is maturity in letting dynamics loosen without resentment. And there is deep self-respect in not forcing yourself to stay energetically entangled where you no longer feel aligned. Over time, something subtle happens. The loneliness softens. You begin noticing smaller but more genuine connections. Conversations that feel slower but truer. People who don't require you to perform your old role. People who meet you where you are now. But they can only meet you if you stop pretending to be who you were. Outgrowing is not arrogance. It is evolution. And evolution does not always look like expansion. Sometimes it looks like fewer invitations, fewer messages, fewer intense exchanges, but more peace, more clarity, more coherence between who you are inside and how you show up outside. If you are in this stage, remind yourself, you are not abandoning people. You are no longer abandoning yourself. That shift may create temporary loneliness, but long-term authenticity always creates deeper belonging. The space you feel right now is not emptiness. It is room. Room for connection that matches your current depth. Room for conversations that feel nourishing instead of familiar. Room for relationships built on shared awareness rather than shared wounds. Stay patient in the quiet. Let dynamics evolve naturally. And trust that the version of you who feels slightly out of place today is simply stepping into a more honest way of relating tomorrow. Outgrowing people is rarely dramatic. It does not always come with conflict or betrayal. Sometimes it arrives quietly, as distance, as reduced intensity, as a subtle feeling that something has shifted. And instead of empowerment, you feel loneliness. But loneliness in this stage is not failure. It is differentiation. Carl Jung believed that individuation requires separating from unconscious group patterns. As you become more aware of who you are, you naturally detach from roles and dynamics that once defined you. That detachment can feel cold at first. You miss the ease. You miss the automatic belonging. You miss the version of yourself that fit without friction. But belonging built on performance is fragile. Belonging built on authenticity takes time. You are not required to cut people off harshly. You are not required to explain your evolution in detail. You are only required to remain honest with yourself. If certain conversations feel draining, notice that. If certain dynamics feel tight, acknowledge that. If you feel calmer but slightly alone, trust that recalibration is happening. Growth often reduces intensity before it increases depth. You are not losing everyone. You are refining. And while refinement may temporarily shrink your social world, it makes space for connections that match who you are now, not who you had to be before. Loneliness during growth is not punishment. It is the space between who you were and the relationships that fit who you are becoming.